In the golden halls of ancient Rome, beneath the marble columns and the scent of imperial incense, there existed a secret world few dared to speak of, and even fewer survived. Behind closed doors of Caligula's palace, beauty meant danger, and innocence had no value. He was just a boy, taken, trained, touched by power, witness to a world of madness where the emperor's desires were law, and boys were silenced with gifts or death. But one of them lived. He watched emperors fall. He saw what no citizen ever dared imagine. And now, after decades of silence, the story is finally being told. Subscribe, because this is one of the most disturbing truths buried by history, and someone has tried to keep it forgotten for 2,000 years. Rome, 37 AD, the city roared like a beast. Chariots clattered down uneven stone roads, merchants shouted in 7 languages, and the scent of roasted meat mixed with sewer water in the sticky summer air. At the edge of the Forum, in the shadow of the Capitoline Hill, stood a boy no more than 10, dressed in rags that barely reached his knees. His name was Lucius, though no one had called him that since his mother died 3 winters earlier. He had no family now, only hunger and fear. Lucius wasn't a slave yet, not officially, but that morning he had stolen a fig from a merchant's store. He ran, he was caught, and by midday he was stripped, scrubbed, and standing barefoot in the slave market with a wax tablet around his neck that read, "Strong lungs, quick reflexes, obedient." He didn't understand why men kept touching his arms, or why they leaned in so close to his face. A fat Roman in purple trim even tugged at his hair, laughing. That was when he arrived. A man in a fine red tunic, younger than most, with a scroll in one hand and rings on every finger. His name was Silvanus, and he worked directly for the emperor. Lucius didn't know it then, but he had just been chosen. He was taken not to a villa, not to a farm, not even to the mines. He was taken to the Palatium Caligula, Caligula's private wing of the imperial palace. A place most Romans had never seen, a place most senators pretended didn't exist. There were no chains, there were no beatings. Instead, there were cushions of silk, warm baths scented with oil, and slaves who whispered instead of shouting. Lucius was given new clothes, a pale blue tunic that reached just above his knees. He was taught to bow, to smile, to speak softly. They told him how to hold a wine cup, how to look at a man without looking too directly, how to breathe without speaking. He still didn't know why, not yet. He met the others on his second day, 4 boys, all young, all beautiful. One had hair like fire, another had eyes like ice. They didn't speak much, but they watched closely. One of them, the oldest, maybe 12, sat beside Lucius that night and whispered, "Don't try to leave. No one does." Lucius asked, "What is this place?" The boy said nothing for a moment, then leaned in. "They call it the Harem, but they don't use that word, not in front of him." That evening they were summoned. A procession moved through the halls. Musicians, servants with fruit trays, perfume bearers, and finally the boys, bathed, dressed and arranged like decorations. They were brought into a vast hall of marble and gold, where he sat on a cushioned throne, bare-chested and drunk with power. Caligula. He was younger than Lucius expected, no beard, sharp cheekbones, eyes that smiled and threatened. At once, Lucius stepped forward when told. He bowed, and the emperor's voice rang out, playful and dangerous, "A new one, let's see if he sings." The room laughed. Lucius did not. He had only just arrived, and the nightmare had only begun. The palace was not only a maze of corridors and silk, but of rules unspoken and expectations unwritten. After his first audience with Caligula, Lucius was not taken back to the slave quarters. Instead, he was brought to a chamber unlike any he had ever seen, walls covered in crimson drapery, ceiling painted with winged cupids, and a scent of frankincense that clung to his lungs. This was where the training began. A woman named Cassia, neither servant nor mistress, arrived with a scroll and a cold expression. She was beautiful, and yet her beauty held no warmth. She did not smile when she greeted Lucius. She simply said, "You will be quiet unless spoken to. You will learn quickly or you will be replaced." Replaced. The word echoed in Lucius's head like thunder. She began with posture, how to sit with grace, how to lower one's eyes while still appearing attentive. She corrected every movement, a flinch, a cough, a twitch of the fingers. Lucius learned quickly that pain didn't only come from whips. Sometimes it came from cold silence and knowing that someone was watching your every breath for flaws. The days blurred into routine. In the mornings, Lucius was taught how to read facial cues when Caligula was amused, when he was bored, when he was about to erupt into madness. In the afternoons, the boys were taught dances, not childish games, but slow, fluid movements meant to please, to tease, to impress. By the 3rd week, Lucius could no longer recall the rhythm of freedom. One evening, after a long session where Cassia had forced him to hold a difficult pose for hours until his legs trembled, he collapsed on a cushion next to Severus, one of the older boys. Lucius whispered, "How long have you been here?" Severus didn't respond right away. Then, quietly, "Since I was your age. I turned 13 last week." Lucius blinked. "And do we ever leave?" Severus looked away. Caligula appeared unpredictably sometimes. He would stroll into the training hall unannounced, barefoot, his wine spilling as he laughed at some private joke. Other times he would watch silently from behind a screen, his face unreadable. Once, Lucius stumbled during a turn and fell. A gasp echoed through the chamber. The other boys froze, but Caligula laughed. "At least he's not dull," he said, sipping wine. Then, to Cassia, "Let's see if he can entertain with stories or lies, whichever he knows best." That night, Lucius was summoned to the emperor's private chamber. There was no stage, no audience, just the boy, the emperor, and a golden bowl of figs. Caligula gestured for him to sit and asked, "What do you miss most from before?" Lucius hesitated. "My mother," he said softly. Caligula's eyes narrowed. "What did she look like?" Lucius began to answer, but the emperor waved a hand. "No, show me. Become her." Lucius didn't understand. Then he did, and something in him cracked. That night, back in his chamber, Lucius didn't cry. He stared at the ceiling and wondered if the boy who had once stolen figs still existed, or if the palace had eaten him whole. The next morning, Cassia entered his room and found him sitting straight-backed, eyes alert, hands folded perfectly. She said nothing. He was learning. The sun over Rome no longer mattered to Lucius. Days and nights blurred beneath the high ceilings of the palace. Time wasn't measured by hours anymore, only by the sound of sandals in marble halls, the scent of oil lamps being lit, and the sudden summoning of a name in the night. For Caligula, life was a game, and boys were pieces on his board. Lucius had become one of his favorites. This did not mean safety. It meant danger cloaked in perfume and silk. The emperor was restless, always. He would plan elaborate banquets, not for food, but for spectacle. On one such night, Lucius and 4 other boys were ordered to dress as gods. They wore golden laurel wreaths and were painted in white powder. Their tunics were translucent, their eyes forced to sparkle with false joy. Cassia gave them a warning before the procession began. "Whatever he asks, you smile." They entered to thunderous applause from senators, generals, and foreign envoys. But the room did not look at them with kindness. It was hunger disguised as admiration. Lucius could feel their gazes like invisible fingers. Caligula sat on his throne in the center. "Bored already? Dance for them," he ordered, his voice loud over the lyre's tune. "Let the gods amuse the mortals." They danced. Lucius tried not to tremble, but it wasn't only dances the emperor demanded. He played twisted games behind closed doors, games where boys had to compete for his amusement. He would pit them against each other in mock trials. Or worse, ask them to tell lies about the others, then punish whoever lied least convincingly. Truth became irrelevant. Only survival mattered. "One night," he whispered in Lucius's ear, "if I asked you to betray the others, would you do it with grace?" Lucius replied, "If you command it, I'll do it with a smile." He hated himself for that answer. But he lived. The palace grew quieter in whispers, but louder in fear. Lucius learned that the boy before him, one who had spoken out of turn, who had cried during a banquet, he vanished the next morning. No one mentioned him again. Lucius began keeping secrets inside his own body, like locked boxes behind his ribs. He smiled when told. He danced when ordered. He kissed the emperor's ring and thanked him for every glance, but at night, he remembered his name, Lucius. He whispered it to himself as if it might vanish forever if he stopped. One afternoon, while walking through the garden with other boys, Lucius overheard a senator murmur to Cassia, "He's lasted longer than the others." Cassia replied, "He knows how to survive." Lucius turned his head slightly. He didn't smile. Not this time, but something was changing. In Caligula's eyes, in the whispers of the guards, in the sharp tension in the air. The emperor had begun speaking to the moon. He raged at the ocean. He executed servants for bringing cold figs. One night, he asked Lucius, "If I died, would the stars mourn me?" Lucius said softly, "The world would fall silent." Caligula smiled, but behind it, something flickered. Fear. That night a storm broke over Rome. Lucius watched it from his window, lightning flashing against the marble columns. He knew, somehow, that the world inside the palace was about to change, and that he would have to change with it, or not survive at all. By the time Lucius turned 11, the palace had grown darker, not in its marble or its mosaics, those still gleamed in the sunlight, but in its spirit. The laughter that once echoed through its halls had soured into suspicion. Servants avoided eye contact. Guards gripped their spears tighter. Even the doves in the garden cooed less. Caligula had changed. He no longer summoned music, only silence. No longer asked for wine, but blood. His jokes ended in executions, and his whims were more dangerous than any blade. Lucius felt it. He could see it in Cassia's eyes too, now lined with fear where once there was only cold control. One night, the emperor threw a banquet for no reason at all. Lucius and the other boys were made to wear silver masks and stand along the walls like statues. They were told not to speak, not to breathe too loudly. The guests laughed nervously, sipping wine laced with something sharper. Suddenly, Caligula stood, slammed a goblet to the floor, and shouted, "Who among you loves me most?" The room fell silent. He pointed to a senator. You or you. His fingers swung like a sword. Then, to Lucius and you. My little ghost, would you die for me? Lucius froze. Every lesson screamed inside his bones. Smile, answer, survive, he whispered. If you wish it, my life is yours. Caligula laughed. A high, unstable sound. And then he kissed Lucius on the forehead and sat down again, but the emperor's mind was rotting. His paranoia grew like mold. He accused his own sisters of plotting his death. He ordered senators flogged in public. He made horses priests, and every night he asked the moon why it no longer spoke to him. Lucius began to dream of escape, but there was no door, no tunnel, only shadows. One dawn, Lucius awoke to shouting. Steel against stone, boots, blood. The Praetorian Guard had turned by midday. Caligula was dead, stabbed dozens of times in the corridor where he once made Lucius recite poetry. His blood still marked the walls. Lucius was found trembling under a silk curtain, certain he was next, but the guards passed him. They weren't there for him. They were there to erase the emperor. The palace emptied in the days that followed. Senators took back their homes, servants looted and vanished. Cassia was gone. Severus too. Lucius wandered alone through halls that had once terrified him, past golden fountains and shattered goblets, past tapestries ripped from walls. He found Caligula's throne room cold and silent. The throne stood empty. Lucius stepped onto it. He sat, and for a moment, he felt nothing, just silence. A week later, a kind-faced scribe named Gaius found him in the old bathhouse, thin and mute. He took Lucius into his care, unaware of the boy's past, unaware of the things Lucius had seen, of the masks he had worn. But Lucius never forgot. He never would. He had survived the harem. He had survived the games. He had survived Caligula. But the hardest part still lay ahead, learning how to live as a boy again. Years passed. Rome changed. Emperors rose and fell like waves breaking on stone. Statues of Caligula were torn down or defaced, his name removed from public inscriptions, as if the empire could forget him by force. But Lucius remembered. He always remembered he had taken a new name under Gaius's care, Marcus, simple and Roman. He grew tall, with dark eyes and quiet strength. He worked as a scribe, living among scrolls and ink instead of silken chains. No one knew what he had survived until the day someone asked the wrong question. It was a senator, elderly and foolishly nostalgic, during a late dinner in the Senate. Archives Caligula, the man said with a smirk. He was a madman, yes, but at least he was passionate. Rome has grown dull since. The word struck Marcus like a dagger. He stood, quietly, hands trembling. Do you think passion excuses cruelty? The room went still. The old senator chuckled nervously. You speak like someone who knew him. Marcus looked at his inks. Hence I knew his silence. I knew his games. I knew what it meant to smile with a bruised heart. That night, Marcus lit a lamp and took out parchment for the first time. He wrote not for Rome, not for records, but for himself. He wrote, I was taken at age 10. I was trained like a songbird, caged in silk and fear. I danced for men who called it art, who called it favor, who pretended their hands were not bloodied with the innocence of children. He wrote of Severus, of Cassia, of the boy who vanished, of Caligula's whispers in the dark. He wrote not in anger, but in truth, because no one had told it, because Rome, for all its glory, had always buried its shame beneath gold. He gave the testimony to Gaius, read it in silence. Then he placed it in a sealed scroll and whispered, this will not be easy, but it must be remembered. The scroll disappeared into the imperial library, not for the Senate, not for the crowds, but for history. For the day Rome was ready to face its own reflection. Years later, as an old man, Marcus sat beneath an olive tree with a child on his lap, his grandson. The boy asked, were you ever afraid as a child? Marcus smiled softly. Yes, but I learned to survive. The boy tilted his head. How? Marcus looked at the setting sun, warm on his face. By remembering who I was, even when they tried to take it from me, because Rome had tried to erase him, but he had lived. He was more than a boy in a harem. He was more than the emperor's puppet. He was Lucius, and now the world would know.